Since we were little, we've been taught that life needs to have a grand purpose, a meaning that justifies everything. But what if this search is an illusion? What if, in reality, nothing makes sense? It sounds scary, doesn't it? But what if I told you this could be the greatest freedom you've ever had? Albert Camus, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, believed that life doesn't need a fixed meaning to be lived intensely. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. How embracing the absurd can set you free and transform the way you see life. Wake up, get out of bed, have coffee, work, go home, sleep, and repeat. For many, life has become an endless loop, where each day is a blurry copy of the one before. At first, the routine even feels like a refuge, a safe harbor against the chaos of the unknown. But over time, this predictability becomes suffocating. Have you ever felt that? The sensation of being trapped in a cycle where nothing seems new, where the enthusiasm you once had has been replaced by a kind of autopilot. It's not just physical exhaustion, it's something deeper, a weariness of the soul, a fatigue that comes not from overexertion, but from a lack of purpose. And then, on an ordinary day, between a sip of coffee and a blank stare at your phone screen, the uncomfortable question arises, what's the point of all this? In the middle of endless meetings, unanswered messages, and bills that never stop, a thought flashes through your mind like lightning. What's the meaning of it all? And this doubt is dangerous because once it appears, you can't ignore it anymore. It hangs over your shoulders like a shadow, making every mechanical task even more unbearable. It's not just a desire for change. It's an existential restlessness, a deep discomfort that suggests maybe this whole machinery of routine is just a well-staged play, but one that's empty of meaning. And what makes this even stranger is that this feeling doesn't discriminate. It can hit the recent graduate who expected a world full of possibilities, just as much as the person who's lived for decades and realizes that very little has truly changed. Great thinkers in philosophy and psychology have reflected on this. After all, has life always been this way? Or did we, at some point, convince ourselves that existence is just a checklist of obligations? If it were just physical exhaustion, a weekend of rest would fix it. But when the fatigue is existential, no break seems enough. And it's not just the weight of routine. There's also an internal conflict. At the same time that we want something different, we're afraid of the unknown. How do you escape a vicious cycle when it also offers a certain sense of security? This is where life becomes a dilemma. Go with the flow and accept this reality, or question it. Seek something beyond. Risk destabilizing everything. For some, the answer is to distract themselves with small pleasures, binge-watching shows, buying new things, making plans for the next holiday. But does that really solve anything? Or does it just postpone the inevitable confrontation with the question that keeps echoing in your mind? What if, in the end, this anguish isn't a mistake but a symptom? A sign that something inside us senses. We were made for more than just existing on autopilot. Maybe the problem isn't the routine itself, but how we perceive it. What would happen if, instead of fighting this doubt, we used it as fuel for something greater? There was a time when the big questions of life had ready-made answers. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What happens after death? For centuries, religion offered comforting explanations. No matter how hard life got, there was a greater purpose, a destined path, something beyond what the eyes could see. This certainty gave people a reason to keep going. There was no need to doubt, no need to question. But time passed, the world changed, and those certainties began to crumble. With the advancement of science, what was once a mystery began to be explained rationally. Thunder was no longer the voice of the gods, but an electrical phenomenon in the atmosphere. The stars weren't lanterns in the sky, but enormous masses of gas burning in the vacuum of space. Gradually, the world became more understandable, but also colder. The promise of a grand meaning was replaced by numbers, equations, and natural laws. And that's where the problem arose. If everything can be explained, where does the mystery lie? And without mystery, where do we find meaning? The void began to emerge. Before, life was guided by solid beliefs. Now, many people find themselves unmoored. There's no longer a definitive manual telling us how to live. No guarantees that everything is part of a greater plan. So, what's left? For some, this void has become a liberation, a chance to choose their own path. For others, it's a nightmare, the feeling of being lost in an indifferent universe. And this feeling isn't rare. If you've ever felt uneasy realizing that nothing comes with a ready-made meaning, know that this restlessness is part of the modern human experience. What makes all of this even more complicated is that society pushes us to keep moving forward without time to reflect. Social media, work, non-stop entertainment, everything is designed to keep the mind occupied, as if questioning were dangerous. But the truth is, ignoring this feeling doesn't make it disappear. At some point, in the middle of the routine, in the silence of a dark room, or even on an ordinary day, the question returns. If nothing has a ready-made meaning, then what am I doing here? Maybe the problem isn't the lack of answers, but the desire to have them. What if, instead of seeking an absolute truth, we could create our own meaning? Perhaps there isn't a right path, but rather the freedom to choose our own. When someone realizes that the old certainties have crumbled, a new feeling can arise: nihilism. The idea that nothing has value or purpose might seem frightening at first. After all, if life has no definitive meaning, why go on? For some, this realization leads to deep discouragement. What was once a search for meaning becomes a plunge into hopelessness. The world loses its color. Small joys seem insignificant, and the mind fills with dark thoughts. And this feeling isn't confined to philosophy books. It appears in the silence of a lonely day, in the apathy towards something that once brought happiness, in the difficulty of finding motivation to keep going. Many feel they're merely existing, without a real reason to continue. Nihilism, when misunderstood, can become a crushing weight. And when this idea mixes with anxiety and depression, the result is a suffocating mental state where each day feels like an unrewarding effort. But what if the lack of meaning wasn't the end of everything? That's the question Camus proposed. Instead of seeing the absurd as a problem, why not view it as an opportunity? If the universe truly doesn't give us a ready-made purpose, then we're free to create our own. There's no fixed script, no obligation to follow a pre-written path. This means that, instead of lamenting the lack of meaning, we can use it as a push to live more authentically. Think about it. If nothing has a definitive meaning, then nothing is out of our reach. You can choose what truly matters to you, without needing to fit into standards or expectations. The problem isn't the lack of answers, but the belief that we need them to keep going. Maybe, instead of desperately seeking a grand purpose, we can find joy in simply being here, experiencing each moment however we want. And this is exactly where Camus' Absurdism comes in. If life has no fixed meaning, then any meaning we give to it is valid. Perhaps it's time to stop searching for answers and start creating our own. Camus' Absurdism begins with a shock. Humans crave meaning, but the universe offers none. This clash between our need to find answers and the world's total indifference creates a sense of the absurd. But unlike nihilism, which sees this as a dead end, absurdism sees a liberating possibility. If the world doesn't give us a ready-made purpose, then we have the chance to create our own. What seemed like a curse might actually be the greatest freedom anyone could have. To illustrate this idea, Camus uses the myth of Sisyphus. Imagine a man condemned by the gods to push a massive boulder up a mountain only to watch it roll back, down, repeating this cycle for eternity. At first glance, it seems like a meaningless torture, a cruel punishment. But what if Sisyphus accepted his condition? What if, instead of lamenting, he found satisfaction in the simple act of pushing the boulder? That's the key to absurdism, the revolt against the desire for a grand purpose and the choice to live fully, even without guarantees. Accepting the absurd doesn't mean giving up. On the contrary, it means letting go of the illusion that we need a cosmic meaning to live intensely. This gives us radical freedom. If life doesn't have a single, obligatory meaning, then any path we choose can be valid. Someone might find meaning in art, another in learning, another in the simple pleasure of watching a sunset. When we're not tied to the need for a fixed destiny, we can experience life with less fear and more curiosity. Think about it. If you knew life had no universal, absolute meaning, how would you choose to live it? What would you do if there were no pressure to follow a predetermined script? Absurdism teaches us that instead of being paralyzed by the lack of meaning, we can see it as an opportunity to explore, create, and discover. It's like being in an open field where every step can be a genuine choice, not just a repetition of what we've been told we should do. And the most important question is, how do we live in this freedom? If life doesn't demand a fixed purpose, then every moment can be lived with lightness, without carrying the weight of searching for a grand meaning. But this requires a new perspective on the present and on our own choices. The first thing to understand about living in absurdism is that clinging to the past or obsessing over the future only brings suffering. Most people live waiting for an ideal moment. When I get that job, I'll be happy. When I find the right person, my life will improve. When I have enough money, everything will make sense. But the future never arrives as we imagine it, and the past can't be changed. What if, instead of constantly seeking the right path, we accepted the present as it is? This doesn't mean resignation, but learning to live now, without the anxiety of trying to control what's beyond our reach. The second principle is rebellion against the absurd. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? Not really. If life has no cosmic meaning, then no one can dictate how you should live it. Instead of surrendering to despair, choose to find joy even knowing the world offers no ready-made purpose. It's an act of revolt against meaninglessness. You can decide to enjoy each day, laugh at the absurd, create your own experiences, and not let yourself be dominated by rules that make no sense to you. Camus said that the absurd only wins if we become passive in the face of it. But by living fully, even knowing nothing has a fixed meaning, we're defeating the absurd at its own game. The third principle is the most liberating of all. Adopt the spirit of why not? When we realize nothing has a fixed purpose, any choice becomes valid and, in a way, fun. Do you want to learn to play an instrument but think you're too old for it? Why not try anyway? Do you want to change careers, even without being sure of the future? Why not take the risk? Do you simply want to try something new without a deep reason? Go ahead. If there's no obligatory path to follow, then any path can be interesting. This mindset takes the weight off decisions and turns life into a field of possibilities, rather than a sequence of choices burdened with fear and regret. In the end, living in absurdism doesn't mean becoming cynical or indifferent. It means freeing yourself from the need for definitive explanations and embracing existence as it is. If you've ever felt suffocated by the relentless search for a greater purpose, maybe it's time to ask yourself, what if the secret isn't finding meaning, but creating moments that are worthwhile in themselves? And speaking of that, what really makes a moment worthwhile? Perhaps the answer lies in something much simpler than we imagine. Modern life teaches us that we need to chase big goals to be happy, to succeed, accumulate wealth, gain recognition. But what if all of that is just an illusion? What if we're spending our energy chasing something that deep down will never be enough? Camus invites us to look elsewhere. What if happiness lies in the small moments, in the things we usually ignore? A hot coffee on a cold day, a leisurely conversation, a book that makes you forget the world for a few hours. When we stop searching for a grand cosmic purpose, we can finally see the little things that make life enjoyable. But to live this way, we must question one of society's greatest traps, the obsession with status and social validation. We spend our lives trying to prove something to others, that we're successful, intelligent, respected. We buy things to impress, work beyond what's necessary to earn a title, and shape our choices based on what others will think. But if none of that really matters, why keep carrying that weight? This need for recognition is just another boulder we've chosen to push. Is it worth it? And this is where the power of "so what" comes in. A simple but extremely effective way to deal with challenges, frustrations, and expectations that suffocate us. Did someone criticize your choices? So what? Did you fail at something? So what? Didn't achieve that goal that seemed so important? So what? The world keeps spinning, and most of the things we worry about have no real relevance in the long run. This isn't about carelessness or irresponsibility, but about learning to differentiate what truly matters from what's just taking up space in your mind. When you adopt this mindset, life becomes lighter. Small mistakes stop being tragedies. Others' expectations lose their power over you, and external pressures become background noise. Freedom isn't about having all the answers, but about no longer giving so much weight to things that, in the end, are just distractions. If nothing has an absolute meaning, then everything can be lived more loosely, without carrying unnecessary burdens. But if we don't need to prove anything to anyone, if meaning isn't something imposed on us, then what's really worth it? The answer to that depends on where we place our attention and energy. If nothing has an absolute meaning, then life doesn't come with a manual. This might be scary, but it also brings a rare gift: the freedom to choose where to put your energy. In a world where we're bombarded with information, opinions, and expectations, most people live reacting to what happens, without ever stopping to ask themselves, does this really matter to me? They spend time and emotion worrying about things that deep down don't change anything. They argue over opinions that lead nowhere, lose sleep over others' judgments, and carry guilt imposed by a society that doesn't even know who they really are. But what if you could decide what to care about? The truth is, life isn't about doing everything, but about choosing wisely where to place your attention. When you realize that time and energy are the most precious resources you have, you start being more selective. What's more valuable? Spending hours arguing with someone who won't change their mind, or using that time to learn something new, worrying about what others think of you, or embracing the freedom to be who you really are? Many people spend their lives trying to please others, and only realize too late that they were drifting away from themselves. You can avoid that now. And to do this, you need to accept an uncomfortable truth. You can't control everything. You can't change what others think. You can't predict the future. You can't guarantee that everything will always work out. But you can decide how to react to situations. If something is beyond your control, is it worth spending energy on? If someone treats you negatively, is it worth absorbing that energy or moving on? Learning to differentiate what deserves your attention from what's just a distraction is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. This shift in mindset doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with small decisions. Whenever something irritates or worries you, ask yourself, does this really matter? If the answer is no, let it go. If the answer is yes, direct your energy toward it consciously, without getting lost in the chaos of the world. The power isn't in finding a universal meaning, but in choosing which battles are worth fighting. And in the end, the greatest victory against the absurd isn't finding a definitive answer, but simply learning to live more lightly and authentically. Maybe happiness isn't about understanding everything, but about accepting life as it is. If the universe doesn't give us a ready-made meaning, and if the certainties we once had no longer make sense, what are we left with? For many people, this realization might seem frightening, but for Camus, it was precisely the key to freedom. The greatest victory against the absurd isn't trying to defeat it, but embracing it. In other words, it's not about finding a grand purpose to justify everything, but accepting that life can be lived without needing a definitive explanation. This might seem strange at first because, from a young age, we're taught that we must strive for something greater, a goal, a supreme purpose, a reason to exist. But what if life didn't need any of that to be enjoyed? This idea is summed up in one of Camus' most striking phrases. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Think about it. Sisyphus, condemned to push the boulder eternally, could be seen as a symbol of endless suffering. But what if he simply accepted his condition? What if he found satisfaction in the very act of pushing the boulder without needing a greater reason? Suddenly, his task would no longer be a punishment, but simply a way of existing. This is what Camus proposes. Instead of tirelessly seeking an external meaning to justify life, we can simply live, enjoy the good moments, face the challenges, and find pleasure in the small things without needing a cosmic justification for it. This doesn't mean we should abandon all our goals or stop caring about things. On the contrary, it means that instead of living in the anguish of chasing an unattainable meaning, we can choose what brings us pleasure, what brings us joy, what makes life worth living for us. And when we accept that life doesn't need a fixed purpose, we become freer to explore, experiment, and create our own way of existing. After all, if everything is absurd, why not have fun with it? Why not make the most of every moment without carrying the weight of questions that don't need answers? In the end, defeating the absurd isn't about finding a definitive meaning. It's about living without needing one. It's waking up in the morning and deciding that, even without a grand purpose, that hot cup of coffee can still be enjoyable, a laugh can still be genuine, and a hug can still warm the heart. It's understanding that happiness isn't about discovering an absolute meaning, but simply being present and living the best way you can. And now I ask you, if the world has no fixed purpose and you can choose whatever you want, what will you do with this freedom? If you've made it this far, leave a like and a comment. Check out the books I recommend in the first comment.